Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to A Street Apologist Live. In studio, we have Dr. Joseph Kezele. We're going to be discussing Phanatik's book today, Brady Goodwin Jr., specifically his chapter on evolution, and I'm very excited about this. This is Street Apologist Live. Please subscribe, hit the like button, please share, please comment. This is the program where we serve the underserved and look into the overlooked. With that, let's get started. Welcome to the studio, Dr. Joseph Kezele. How you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I sure appreciate being here. Thank you so much.
Well, yes, I first came in contact with you because of the Arizona Origin Science Association, AZOSA. Can you please tell us a little bit about that and your guys' wonderful website?
Yeah, we're a statewide organization. It's a ministry that focuses on the truth of Scripture, that science confirms God's Word, because the author of the Word is the author of the world. He's one and the same, and he does not contradict himself.
Amen. That's exactly right. And, I've been to some of the meetings, the AZOSA meetings. I've been there, and I've heard you present. I've heard a number of other people present. Let's say someone's in the Southwest area. How can they find out what's going on and see some of the content?
Well, our website, azosa.org, is easily found on the web, and there are buttons at the top on the home page, and you can click on events and find out what's going on in a county in which you're located or near to you.
Excellent. And you've been a man of science and medicine for a long time. Are you able to tell people about what you did in your professional life before you were starting chapters of AZOSA everywhere?
Well, I was an emergency physician, board certified, practiced emergency medicine for 25 years after completing my training. I went to the University of Arizona, both undergraduate and medical school, and then practiced medicine. Then after retiring from that, focused on teaching creation science.
Excellent. And you teach at Arizona Christian University. Tell people a little bit about what you got going on there, brother.
Yes, I've been on faculty there now for 12 years, and we have a great pre-med program, degree in Bachelor of Science in Biology with a pre-med focus, not just for medical school, but all of the health graduate schools prepare for that. And one of my preferred classes, most fun classes, is the Creation Science Apologetics course we have there.
Yeah, and you also have something called the Creation Club.
Yes, we do. It's actually a joint work of the Arizona Christian University Creation Club and AZOSA.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, I'm very excited about the day. I believe at one of the recent meetings, I mentioned about this, and you said, yeah, just email me. And so we got in contact, and we kind of went through this book we're going to be looking at today. And I said, let's focus on this one particular chapter here, because obviously it deals with your specialty, which is for evolution. And here's the book. Most people know, Let There Be Gaslight. And the issues we're going to talk about today transcend. They go past just the book, although the book is important, of course, because, it's written by a former urban minister, Christian hip-hop artist, seminary student, Brady Goodwin Jr. We love him. We're not banging on him like that, but we do disagree with what he presents as evidence for evolution. And the evidence he presents for evolution especially can be found in a chapter that is titled Many Convincing Proofs. This is chapter 5. I didn't like that title. I know he's doing a play on words because Jesus gave many convincing proofs after he resurrected from the dead. So it's a play on words, but the evidence for one is better than the evidence for the other, to say the least. So let's deconstruct some of his evidence. And we do have our first super chat today. Thank you very much for that. Crimson Hawk asks, it says great ministry. And then someone asks, is this live or being recorded? Dr. Kezele, is this live or being recorded?
It's both.
It's both. We are live right now. Dr. Kezele is physically in the studio with me. And he said, one thing I noticed is you have a lot of Transformer posters here. I think there might be somewhat of a generation gap there but that's all right. That's all right. What kind of posters did you have in your room when you were a kid? Or if you could have, what would you have had?
Things relating to Russia. I was, in addition to being a chemistry major, I majored in Russian.
Yeah, you got your bachelor's in Russian, correct?
Correct.
And actually, little rabbit trail, you've done a lot of mission trips to Eastern Europe and Russia promoting creation science and using it as evangelism and education, right?
That's true.
If you guys want to see some of his work, you can actually search his name in the Answers in Genesis website, and he will pop up.
And the interesting thing is, when working with the Christians in those various countries, they would get me into the state medical schools, the state universities, and as well as seminaries and churches, which I can't get into the state schools here.
Oh, so you could get into the state schools in Russia, but not in the United States.
Exactly. And not only Russia, but the other Eastern European countries as well.
Well, that is fascinating. Okay, well, that seems a little backwards, and I guess that's the irony of the point. Okay, so let's give a shout out one more time to the super chat folks and the live chat folks. Thanks everyone for coming in. Please share this video. We're going to get into some interesting stuff, and Dr. Joseph Kezele is more than qualified, and I always enjoy when I see his presentations and hear him talk. And we are live right now. It's literally 10:03 a.m. in Phoenix, and he's local here, and he was gracious enough to come down to the studio downtown, and now here we are talking. So we open up the book, and we see that he immediately gets into evidence for evolution.
And I'd like to comment on that word evidence. We all have the same evidence, either side of the question, but how that evidence is interpreted depends upon our presuppositions, our assumptions. And so the evolutionists presuppose evolution and then use circular reasoning to interpret the evidence to make it appear to be true, whereas the creationist presupposes the truth of Scripture, uses that history as the starting point, and then looks at the evidence and see which model fits best.
And so it really is about the lens through which you see what's there, because we're looking at the same stuff.
Exactly.
And that's important. And so, unfortunately, Brady, he has changed his lens. Now, he would say the evidence brought him there. He would, that's the way he would talk about it. And he in interviews talks about when Peter Enns was kicked out of Westminster for having non-literal interpretations of Genesis, and he was a student at Westminster, that's kind of what got him thinking. And he begins trying to respond to objections he says Christians will make. Objection 1, an atheistic attempt to dethrone God. And he just basically says, no, that's not what evolution is. It's not an atheistic attempt to dethrone God, although it does seem Brady is somewhat of an atheist himself these days. But that was not much, but what do you think about that first objection and his response there?
Well, actually, in private correspondence, Charles Lyell admitted that his point was to dethrone the writings of Moses. The whole point of evolution is to lead people away from God.
Can you tell people who Lyell is, though, so they know who that
Charles
is?
Lyell was a lawyer, but he studied geology, and he looked at the geology. He was a British man, and he chose to interpret the geology in terms of very long ages, gradual, slow processes. And so he would interpret things in the term called uniformitarianism, uniform being the root of that word, and that everything has been going on at the same slow process at which it is measured today. And the assumption is unchanged rate in the past, so therefore uniformitarianism. And that's an assumption that in certain areas we've already been able to disprove.
And so I think a biblical view would be more maybe what you might call catastrophism. I know this is an older book, but this is the book that kind of really brought out the contrast, at least for me. I wasn't reading it when it was first published, but this book brought out the contrast about the differences in how we view history of the earth in relationship to catastrophe or uniformitarianism.
And that book is critically important because published in 1960, it was what sparked the modern creation science movement. That was a seminal book.
Yeah, you got Henry Morris and John Whitcomb, a scientist and an Old Testament scholar there. Now, nextly, objection 2, Brady, the author of this book, responds to the idea that the theory is inherently racist. He spends more time on that than he does on the first one. Let me just tell people one book I recommend, and then I'd like to hear Dr. Kezele's view. This is a good book right here, Darwin's Plantation, Ware and Ham, and it's actually difficult to read a lot of it because there's some tragedy in here. But Darwin's Plantation, I think, is an interesting book related to this point. But I know it's not our main point, but your reaction to that and his response.
Well, the thing is, he tries to separate inherent racism from the fact that evolution did magnify many orders of magnitude the racist thinking in the Victorian world. And so that the theory of evolution became a way of putting a veneer of respectability on racism and a pseudoscientific foundation for it.
Yeah, it definitely did. And I want people to understand he does a compare and contrast right after that in a section where he compares it to Christianity and Christians and things like that, called Race and Religion. But everyone should understand there's a big difference in, are your views and behaviors potentially in line with an underlying assumption, an underlying foundation, or are they out of step with an underlying assumption? Here's what I mean. If we believe all people were created from Adam and Eve, they're all made in the image of God. God, according to Paul and according to the Bible, even determined the places and times that they would live in. So this is all, the culture you're in, everything. This is what he says to the Stoics and Epicureans in Acts 17. And we see that God determining the boundaries and all that kind of stuff. We hold to that. Bigotry is out of step with that. Bigotry, prejudice, with an evolutionary framework is not necessarily out of step with it, because you could say, our tribe versus this tribe, our survival versus their survival. And of course, it's evolution red in tooth and claw. There is no determining morality that one must obey, because the final goal is not to do something just. The final goal would be to survive. So he mixes and matches, but we have to remember which one is out of step with which. I just want to bring that point up. I don't know if you have anything before we move on to the next part.
Well, yes. The genetic difference between any two people on the planet is about 1/10 of 1%. But the genetic differences for so-called racial characteristics is about 12 thousandths of 1%. And this shows that there is no biological basis for racism.
Yeah, minuscule differences really expressed ultimately in somewhat superficial traits for the most part.
Well, it's a social construct, not a biological construct.
No doubt. Now, hey, everyone, will you let me know, hit a 1 if you can hear both of us, or if one of us need to be louder or lower, let me know. Sometimes I rely on you guys. You guys help me mix and master. I appreciate that. Shout out to Nate. Shout out to Zantac. Shout out to Mr. Green. Shout out to Rox B in the house. Shout out to Crimson Hulk, I think I already said you, and whoever else we have. Brother, I got to go check something out there. Can you talk about the next section in relationship to natural selection? I'll be right back.
Right. The use of the term natural selection is quite erroneous. It assumes that the environment is the active agent and the organism, an animal or a plant or a person, is the passive victim of the environment, and that therefore these chance random mutations that occur, and they do occur, are then, quote, selected by the environment, but that imputes an intelligence or some kind of knowledge on the part of the environment to be able to select. And this is totally wrong and upside down. The real issue is that the animal is the active agent, or even the plant is the active agent responding to the environment with the information that is encoded in the DNA from the time of creation. And that multiple levels, either at the very basic metabolic pathway level inside a cell, or the cellular level, the tissue level, the organ level, organ system level, even the entire organismal level, that the environment is being continually tracked. So continuous or continual environmental tracking is what is going on, and the information on how to respond to what is detected by that continuous tracking is in the DNA already. And so then changes can be brought about through the tracking, and there are different multiple mechanisms that can be part of this. One of them is sexual reproduction and the shuffling of genes that occurs in meiosis when the eggs and the sperm are created. Another one is by hybridization, in other words, having organisms that are in the same kind but are different species, mating and then remixing, adding back in genes that one of the parents may not have that the other one has. And for example, we see that going on today in North America with wild dogs and coyotes and wolves out there mating, creating these hybrids called coy wolves. And that third mechanism is changes on the DNA, not in the DNA, but on the DNA through chemical means such as methylation or phosphorylation or acetylation, which then alters which genes will be turned on or turned off. And then the fourth mechanism is changes in the sequence of the DNA by genes that move around within the totality of the DNA called the genome. And these were initially nicknamed jumping genes because when they were first discovered, the evolutionists assumed that they just randomly moved around from one place to another in the total DNA, the genome. But we now know with further study, we have actual evidence that that assumption was false and that these are highly programmed, directed changes when a transposon, this type of gene, moves around and turns other genes on or off in response to what is tracked in the environment so that the organism is better able to deal with the environment. So the organism is indeed the active agent, continually tracking and adapting. Adapting is true. But this does not occur through mutations in natural selection because mutations have never once ever been demonstrated to add information to the genome, to the DNA. And as a physician, I've seen too many patients who have a medical problem because of mutations causing loss of information, causing disease and death.
Excellent. Guys, if you want a good lay-level book response to some of the things we're discussing here today, and even specifically to what Dr. Joseph Kezele just said, I'm going to recommend Refuting Evolution 2, Jonathan Sarfati. Refuting Evolution 2. Yeah, I picked this up actually at an AZOSA meeting. See, I'm a good boy. I try to buy at least one product every time I go to a meeting.
And we appreciate that.
Yeah, and chapter 5 is literally, some mutations are beneficial. And so he deals with that and speaks about what they do, which, as you just heard, mutations only eliminate traits. They cannot produce new features. And I've seen some really interesting, analogies, like a deck of cards. If you just keep on shuffling it, you might get different combinations. You may even lose some cards or damage some cards, but you're not going to get new cards that didn't exist in there.
I'd like to respond to that, the business of beneficial mutations. There are a few, indeed, and they do occur through loss of information. A common used example is the wingless beetle that has lost the information for wings, that lives on an island in the ocean, and the wind would blow the beetle off into the ocean, and that would be the end of the beetle. But the cost is the beetle has to walk around to find food and find a mate. But I think a better example that relates more to people is some people have mutations in the proteins that allow the HIV virus to dock with the lymphocyte to be able to enter the lymphocyte and take over and cause disease. And at first this was thought to be fantastic, but with further time, as time went on and study was able to be extended, we found out that the cost is the people who have that mutation also end up losing the ability of the bile ducts to drain bile out of the liver, and that is not compatible with life. So
Right.
there's always a cost to a beneficial mutation because whatever was supposed to happen correctly in the first place doesn't happen as well.
Not only that, but Sarfati here points out that just because you have increased amounts of DNA, that doesn't necessarily equal increased amounts of function. It's not necessarily the same thing, you know?
That's right, because copying errors can occur, and it can increase DNA by either small or significant amounts. But that certainly does not help things. It's like kind of putting some extra sand in the machinery.
Right. And here, if you're able, there's your little spot, because that way people will feel like you're looking right at them. Yeah.
Okay.
They might feel like you're looking down on them.
Yeah, I'm just looking at you. That's the thing.
I know. Hey, I can't blame you, brother. I can't blame you. We are in the same room together, just so everyone knows. We just got our own little individual cameras there. Okay, so he speaks about natural selection. You want to point out, the whole idea is a misnomer. But I do think it's interesting, some of the criticisms that he even brings up, but never really deals with in relationship to that idea. Page 92 to 93, not just Wallace, but even some of Darwin's closest allies had a problem with this aspect of his hypothesis. For one, natural selection does not explain why speciation occurs in organisms existing where environmental conditions remain constant, with no observable change in the climate, ratio of male to female population, increases or decreases in predators or available food source, etc. Now, he is assuming it happens here, but even with that, he's saying, well, is it enough? Because this is this third objection. Natural selection is insufficient as a mechanism for evolution. But he never really deals with any of these potential objections,
Well, I think that's all irrelevant because it doesn't happen at all.
You're saying, when you say natural selection doesn't happen, I know you said it when I was out there, but
Right.
Can you explain exactly what you mean? Because that approach is different, I think, that people may be used to.
Right. Yeah. You see, continuing to speak in the terms of natural selection is missing the whole point, because that's not what occurs. Again, it's the continuous environmental tracking and the organism being the active agent with those different mechanisms of adapting that I went through, listed, and gave details of. And so it's not the environment that selects, it's the organism that actively responds to the information that it detects at the various levels in the organism.
What about this paragraph, brother? This is from page 93. I know you got the book in front of you as well. Also challenging the idea, and he puts it in quotes, of natural selection as the sole driver of evolution was the observation that, in some cases, speciation seems to occur where there has not been enough time for variation to occur. Speciation seems to occur where there has not been enough time for variation to have happened gradually. Rather, within a generation or two, degrees of variation could be detected. A most serious objection is the question of how an adaptation in the parent makes its way into the constitution of the offspring, which has not yet faced the circumstances that challenge the parent to adapt. Why does the offspring not revert to the species' original form? He never really deals with those either. Can you comment on those, though?
Yeah, this fits very well with the biblical history of rapid speciation after the animals left the ark, with extremely changed conditions, real climate change, for real, global climate change, due to the flood compared to the circumstances that existed prior to Noah's flood. And those mechanisms that I listed are very much how all of this occurred in very rapid fashion. But I can give you an example of today, how we make use of this in terms of across generations, in that we use dogs that have a keen sense of smell to search out for drugs. Well, they're looking, for example, the narcotics, heroin, for example. Well, heroin is created by taking morphine from the opium plant and then converting it, acetylating it, and actually exposing it to acetic acid, which is what vinegar is, a weak solution of, 5% solution of acetic acid. And so since these drug runners don't submit their product to the FDA for inspection, they don't purify the product, and there is residual acetic acid in with the heroin. Well, a pregnant dog is exposed to the smell of acetic acid to affect her pups that are yet to be born. And those pups come out, the next generation come out with an even more highly sensitized ability to sniff out that acetic acid. And that's what they're sniffing for when they're looking for the heroin.
Wow, that's really how it works? That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's through these epigenetic changes, that one mechanism that I mentioned. Yeah.
Wow, fascinating. Okay. So continue on. Here's page 93 still, because this is interesting that some of these are brought up and never answered. It is important to note that Darwin himself acknowledged these issues from the beginning. In The Descent of Man, he reminds his critics that, quote, even in the first edition of The Origin of Species, I distinctly stated inherited effects of use and disuse of both of the body and mind, the direct and prolonged action of changed conditions of life, and occasional reversions of structure, among other factors, all play a role. Nonetheless, evolution as a theory was not widely embraced at first and gained acceptance only gradually. Its dominance came between the 1920s and 1950s as other corroborating evidence began to emerge. So this evidence that we now turn. So he never deals with objections that he himself brought up and then just says, well, let's look at other evidence. And one of the first ones he goes to is radiometric dating.
That's right. But before we get to that, let me go back to the part of your quote there.
Mm-hmm.
Some folks may be familiar with the term Lamarckian mechanism, and that is where it's assumed that acquired change in one organism is actually able to be transmitted to the next generation by use or disuse, simple use or disuse, not through the genetic mechanism I spoke of earlier. And so, for example, the common example given is that of the giraffe, which started out with a short neck and reaches for higher and higher branches, and with each generation it gets longer and longer neck. That's the great example that is used for the Lamarckian change. And Darwin at first was against that, but then he adopted that, added that to his thought process. But getting to the main part of your question about turning to other evidence for evolution and the business of radiometric dating, it needs to be understood that there are three absolutely key and fundamental assumptions made about how radiometric dating works. And those assumptions are, and this goes back to that doctrine of uniformitarianism, that the rate of radioactive decay in the past has been totally unchanged, uniform, constant throughout all of time. That's one major assumption. Another assumption is that the ratio, the ratio of the mother element decaying to the daughter element, such as uranium decaying to lead, or carbon-14 decaying back to nitrogen, that 100% of the mother element was present in the sample, and there was none of the daughter element. In other words, all uranium, no lead, or all carbon-14, no nitrogen. Third assumption is that nothing entered the sample or left the sample, that the sample was left unchanged. And we know, we have great experimental evidence to show that those are false assumptions, and the entire system of radiometric dating, if you're trying to date something older than a couple thousand years, maybe 3,000 years, somewhere in that time range, is simply not going to work.
So we're not really, it's not necessarily against radiometric dating, period. Isn't it, the way I usually hear it phrased is questioning radiometric dating past a certain date?
Yeah, like I say, for maybe a short time period, 2,000 to 3,000 years, because things are not going to have changed a whole lot in that time period compared to what we know has happened in the past. For example, Noah's flood was drastically changed everything. The ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere needs to be constant through all of time for radiometric dating to work. And we have beautiful experimental evidence to show that that's not true. For example, in the first decade of the 1900s, a meteor exploded very low in the atmosphere over a portion of Siberia in the lower Tunguskaya River basin, and it decimated hundreds of square miles of forest. Well, that raised up a tremendous amount of carbon into the atmosphere. And using tree ring studies, measuring the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in subsequent rings for subsequent years after that event, showed that the ratio changed significantly. And so we don't have a constant ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in the atmosphere. And there have been other examples as well, using wood from way back and having the history of the wood from other sources secured. For example, I can't remember the exact year, but somewhere around 400 AD, a supernova exploded, and that also altered the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 in our atmosphere, as do volcanoes. So those things totally destroy that assumption of a constant ratio.
I'm bringing the book actually up on the screen. I got a request from C Road Warrior. Says, may I suggest, vocab, that you take photos of the book and put it on the screen? It's good for everyone to see it. So there it is, now on the screen as requested. We aim to please. And so let's actually look and see what he says here next. He says, let me see here. Hold on. Let me go. There we go. Yep. Some literalists in the young earth creationist camp will want to use flood geology to show that a worldwide catastrophe, the Bible's Noah story, created a confusing geological landscape for our modern investigation techniques. Ken Ham, for one, doubts the reliability of radiometric readings. So that's his kind of dealing, trying to cut it off at the pass. That's what he says there.
Right. Well, like I said, I just gave you examples of how we know that the fundamental assumptions of radiometric dating have been proven false. And another way of looking at this is when you take a freshly killed seal or a freshly killed snail and use carbon dating on those, you get answers of many thousands of years or tens of thousands of years. It's clearly wrong. Or, for example, in Hawaii, witnessed volcanic flow from the year 1800, 1801. No question about the age of that flow. And then that sample is taken and it's dated in millions of years. So we know when we have known dates, radiometric dating is wrong. So how in the world can you rely on it when you have a date of an unknown sample?
Excellent. Let's move on to what he says about paleontology. One of the most convincing areas of evidence for many who accept the theory of evolution is the story told by the fossil record around the world.
Yeah.
Sediments are formed when solid matter, be it rocks or remains of animals, is carried from one place and comes to rest in another. Depending on the conditions, the material thus deposited can be very well preserved for great periods of time. By carefully excavating sedimentary layers or strata, paleontologists have been able to look back millions of years in time. By how the sediments are laid down, we are able to decipher the order of appearance of life on Earth. From fossilized microorganisms that resemble bacteria from 3.5 billion years ago, followed by small worm-like invertebrates around 700 million years ago, then vertebrates, fish 400 million years ago, then the first mammals 200 million years ago.
Well,
is that right?
Again, there are assumptions that are simply not supportable. One is that the lower the rock layer, the older. Well, that would be true if they were always laid down in the same order. But from observations, we know that's not the case, that the order of the strata is different in different locations on the planet. That's one issue. Another issue is that what determined the order of deposition of the fossils? Well, we first of all have fossils that are out of place, anomalous fossils that are not where they belong according to evolutionary story. For example, in the Burgess Shale in the Rocky Mountains of Canada, there what are supposed to be the Precambrian layers, which corresponds to just one-celled organisms, fossils of one-celled organisms in those layers. Then the Cambrian layers right above that are the invertebrates, the critters in the ocean without a backbone, without a spine, so the marine invertebrates. But yet there is a finely formed fish with spine, a real fish, in that layer. It's an out-of-place, anomalous organism. And there's other examples. It's not just one. There's a bunch of examples that show that things are not always the way the evolutionists would like to see them appear consistently. And the other issues are these different types of body plans, the different phyla, the different categories of animals, appear suddenly fully formed. There are no transition fossils. There have been many attempts to find and document transition fossils, but they just don't exist. And so there's been a few that were given tremendous amount of publicity, and they turned out to be a fraud or a fake. And one of the more recent ones was the so-called feathered dinosaur from China, in which someone very skillfully took the body of a dinosaur and tail of a bird and very skillfully crafted them to fit together, since they're from the same rock layer, and then presented that as a transition fossil. And at first it was accepted.
Yeah.
And then...
Do you remember what year was that? Because I think I remember when that came out.
I don't remember the precise year.
Like early 2000s?
Yes, early 2000s.
Yeah, and Dr. Kezele, we should point out, listen, if the evidence in the fossil record for evolution is so strong, no one needs to go about making up transitional forms, like in that case, or about a century prior, Piltdown Man. You don't need to fabricate it if it's there.
Precisely.
Imagine if creationists were doing this. I'm not saying creationists have never made mistakes, but, scientists try to self-correct. But we're talking about out-and-out frauds, and you have an example where these folks want to believe it, so it gets accepted. And then, the correction a lot of times is doesn't gain the same level of publicity. And, related to that, now we have differences among his time scale he would use, but in Darwin's Doubt, Stephen Meyer does make some excellent points about these new body plans and new body types seemingly coming in out of nowhere and then staying the same as if they're already how they should be, type of thing. And again, we can disagree with the time scale. A good book on that would be, you can read Old Earth Creationists on Trial, The Verdict is In, although he's not specifically addressing Meyer there. But I do think the points are important, and it's a great read. So I recommend that.
Yeah, Stephen C. Meyer is an excellent author. He takes complex issues and very well explains them, so most everybody can understand them.
Yeah, excellent. So let's get back into this, and we're going to talk about something he says here, and we've hinted at it, but my background is more in liberal arts and theology and Bible, but I did take at secular institutions, here locally and back in Columbus, anthropology classes. And even there, they obviously didn't want to focus on it. They talked about what we would call anomalies. And this is why this next part is so strange to me. Let me look here. Let me go to the next page in the book here. Okay, here we go. Yeah. The most impressive feature of this study is that consistently these fossils do not appear in any order than what one would expect if evolution had occurred. This is one of the many successful predictions of the theory, because finding just one fossil out of order would falsify it, yet this has never occurred. Dr. Kezele, this book's somewhat problematic. I'll just be charitable. This might be one of the most problematic, erroneous statements in the whole book. It is demonstrably false.
Yeah, I just already gave the example of that fish in the Burgess Shale in the Canadian Rockies. And there are other examples as well. But I'd like to mention that why does the order show up as it does? Well, I think the main issue here is the different ecological zones in the pre-flood world, so that things that lived on the bottom of the ocean would have been buried first, the middle of the ocean next, high ocean next, then coastal areas, and finally inland things. And then the other issue is the mobility of the organism. So things that are able to move more quickly would be able to escape being buried longer. And then also with other issues such as the density of the animal, its shape would be part of the business of what layer it would be found in, as the earth, with everything being soggy and being shaken by tremendous numbers of earthquakes, would cause some degree of settling, determining the final order as well.
For his footnote for this idea that this has never happened, let me show this right here. He cites, let me see, so it may not want to, there we go. Dennis Lamoureux, I always have trouble pronouncing his name. Evolutionary Creation, A Christian Approach to Evolution, page 197. I am having trouble, I'd have to check this out directly. I'm having trouble believing that Dennis wrote a sentence that said there has never been one out of order. I mean, I guess it's possible, but where would a person even get that kind of information? This misunderstanding that, you know, you have the evolutionary time frame, time scale, and never have we found a fossil out of order from where it should be. In fact, we even find whole layers that are sometimes transposed according to the time scale. I mean, I feel like we got to talk about this because this sentence is frankly so egregious.
Right. There are, as you said, there are entire layers of strata that are in a different order in different places of the Earth as well. And of course, that means the fossils within them are in a different order as well. Yeah, you know, it's in science, it's dangerous to say never.
Yeah, that's right. So you know, we all make mistakes, and one of my friends had covered another chapter in this book, and when they reviewed it, they made a few mistakes, and then the author of the book made a video, and then they did a response where they admitted a couple times where they made mistakes, specifically saying that they didn't think he covered something that he did mention in another section of the book, and they said, hey, we made a mistake on that, but our critique stands true, and let's still talk about the big picture. But they admitted that. I am hoping that Brady would look into at least this, if not any other claim, and realize he was simply wrong about this. Is one of the many successful predictions. So he's saying this is evidence of evolution, but the thing is, this is incorrect. And what it shows is, yes, if evolution was true, you might expect that it's always the same layer, same order, same fossils, never in the wrong place. You might expect that, because finding just one fossil out of order would falsify it. Now, Brady, as you look into this, are you going to walk back your trust in evolution? Because we found more than just one fossil out of order. So you're saying it would falsify it. By the sentence in this book, you should do some recalibration. What about this? I mean, do you think this is relevant? What about the idea of living fossils?
Well, yes. They're even referred to as the Lazarus taxon, meaning these categories of fossils that were declared extinct tens or hundreds of millions of years ago, yet we find them alive and well on planet Earth.
The big one I know of is a coelacanth.
Right, that's probably one of the most famous ones, but there are dozens, and they still are showing up. Matter of fact, just recently, another one in South America was found that had been declared extinct. And so, yeah, we're still finding these that were supposedly extinct but are not.
And I don't have all the details in this, but my understanding is with the coelacanth, they mislabeled the coelacanth before it got rediscovered, meaning they put it in all these wrong categories and brackets according to the classification, based upon ideas of, well, this didn't exist in this category, like misunderstanding where it was, so they were forced to kind of label it certain ways. And then when they discover it's still alive, being sold in fish markets, then they realize, oh, we did some mistakes here based upon our assumptions about what this creature was, and yet it's alive.
Well, I think that the more important aspect of that to look at is that they were declared to be a type of fish that, because they had very thick fins called lobe fins, that it walked on the bottom of the ocean and walked out of the ocean and became the transition from marine to terrestrial life.
Oh, they were originally saying that it was one of the walking ones?
Yeah.
I didn't actually realize that.
Yeah.
I knew they say that with, what is it, the Tiktaalik?
Yeah, Tiktaalik, yeah.
Yeah, Tiktaalik.
Which
that's the Darwin sticker, right?
Let me address that one in a moment.
Okay.
But getting back to the coelacanth, there's great video available on YouTube showing that it swims normally as any other fish does, and it does not walk on the bottom of the ocean.
Yeah, see, this kind of thing shows you that, frankly, evolutionists are eager for evidence. As the kids say, they're thirsty. They are thirsty for fossil evidence, and so that's why they leap on things that turn out to later be frauds, and things that they'll say, well, this did that. We know that if the platypus was extinct and it was in the fossil record, you better believe evolutionists be like, look at this amazing transitional form. It's got the elements of this and that, but it's no longer like clearly it was some kind of, they'd be jumping on the platypus, right?
Right. You know, it's funny because when the platypus specimen was first sent to England from Australia, the folks in England thought it was a joke put together by a taxidermist.
Oh, I read about that, which is fascinating, you know?
Yeah. But getting back to Tiktaalik, this is an organism that's supposed to be the transition from fish to a four-legged or having four extremities. Tetrapod is the technical word. Organism that left the ocean and then entered onto land. However, in the fossil record, and this is all according to how evolutionists interpret the ages of the layers of rocks in Poland, trackways of a tetrapod were found that they date 18 million years older than they date Tiktaalik. And so that destroys Tiktaalik as being the transition from marine to terrestrial life.
No doubt. And if you guys look, I did do a program on Tiktaalik. I think if you actually search that in the title, Tiktaallik. But if you search for that in the title, you'll be able to find it actually on the YouTube channel, which you should be subscribed to. Now, check this out. Here's one other paragraph that I want to read about the paleontology evidence he says he gives before the genetics, which I hope that some serious, this sentence needs to be accounted for. As I don't want to harp on it too much, but then again, I want to harp on it too much. Here, let's continue on though. And even though transitional forms between species were missing from the fossil record, at first, eventually fossilized remains begin to surface. They begin to surface, but that doesn't mean they're transitional forms. So, for instance, the line between fish and four-limb vertebrate tetrapods began to blur about 370 million years ago. As Dennis Venema points out, when the first tetrapods began to appear in the fossil record, they bear a remarkable resemblance to lungfish. These amphibian-like fish have both gills and lungs and a form of locomotion that ranges from swimming to walking and bounding like tetrapods and bipedal mammals. Venema is one of many Christians who is also a biologist that firmly believes the evidence for evolution is undeniable.
Again, it goes back to assumption and circular reasoning.
Yeah, so I'd encourage everyone to check up on some of Brady's references here. And when he makes some of these statements, folks, just look up the term fossil anomaly and you'll see what we're talking about. This evolutionary kind of layered cake with everything in order and all the fossils in the right layer and all that, it literally appears in one place on planet Earth, in the evolutionary textbook. Not at the Grand Canyon, not in exposed or unexposed layers, nowhere. It only appears in the textbook. And so you see it, but really it's basically a work of historical fiction, or maybe science fiction if you want to use that term. But that's really what it is. It's an artistic rendering based upon human imagination that actually is not complete in the way it's presented, but you would never know that. And the fossils are sometimes out of order. You have to say, this one's from here, this one's from there. Well, how do you know how the fossil layer is? Well, because the fossil layer contains these kinds of fossils. These fossils date from there. Well, isn't that circular? Yes, but it works. Well, does it work? Anyways, let me slow down.
Well, I think what you said is perfectly right, and that brings out the point that in multiple places, including at the Grand Canyon, more than one place in the Grand Canyon, there are areas where there are tens or hundreds of millions of years of rock layers that are, quote, missing. And they don't know how to explain these tens or hundreds of millions of years of missing rock layers. And they say, oh, well, okay, it was eroded away. But the thing is, the contact between the layer below and the layer above the missing rock layers are perfectly even and tight, and you can't even put a razor blade between them. And there's no way that there would not be erosion to cause an uneven contact between those two layers.
Evidence of rapid deposition, as Guy from Prescott brought up in one of the talks I went to at the AZUSA meeting.
That's right.
Good stuff. Let's continue on here in genetics. in genetics. So there's a lot of he spends more time on this, so we can't go with everything, but at least let me read the opening paragraph again. This is the book we're looking at. This is part of a series where I and a number of apologists are responding to Let There Be Gaslight, written by Brady Goodwin Jr., aka Phanatik, 30 years in ministry, now saying why he left, and we're responding specifically to the chapter titled Many Convincing Proofs, which is him caping for evolution. After being discovered in the 1800s, scientific knowledge regarding DNA, genes, and alleles, alternative sequences of genes, only grew throughout the 20th century. Of particular importance at the genetic level was the study of genetic mutation, how and why new alleles are created, and genetic drift, fluctuation of the frequency of alleles in a population which, given the size of that population, could lead to the emergence of a distinct species over time. These phenomena provided additional and alternative vehicles for evolution aside from Darwin's natural selection. So I want to stop there, everyone. What he's saying is, oh yeah, it's true that natural selection is not the sole driver, but we've got some other things, and so it's multiple things. And I remember in class, when I was in class in anthro, and she was like, well, so is it natural selection? Is it genetic drift? And she named a bunch of things. She's like, which one is it? She's like, all of them. It's like that. But the most important breakthrough came at the end of the 20th century when the human genome was finally fully mapped out in the now famous Human Genome Project, HGP. All right, let's stop there. Let's talk about genetics, evolution, and creation, my friend. What do you got for us, Dr. Kezele?
Well, the original work with the Human Genome Project assumed evolution, and they actually used as a skeleton, as a scaffold, the human genome to compare it with the chimp genome. And there's a very erroneous number that is bandied about tremendously, saying that there's a 98.5% similarity between the chimp genome and the human genome. But that figure applies only to 1.5% of the total DNA. So let me repeat that. They say that there's a 98.5% similarity, but it's only in 1.5% of the total DNA. And that's the amount of DNA that is involved with the production of proteins, which are the machines that do all the work in the cells. But when a full comparison was done of total sequencing of the chimp genome on itself and total sequencing of the human genome on itself, the similarity is actually only about 70% between the chimp and the human genomes. But does that mean we're 70% chimp? And the answer, of course, is no. The issue is not that figure, but the issue is what makes us different. And it's not just the similarity of the genes that are responsible for protein production, because the DNA has two other tremendous tasks. Not only the production of proteins, but regulation of everything that goes on. So regulation is a huge, and so much of the rest of the DNA is responsible for regulating what goes on. And the third task is DNA itself is used for organization. So picture a library, a multi-story library, where some of the DNA indeed is the words on the page, making paragraphs and pages and chapters and books. But some of the DNA is the cover of the book. Some of the DNA is the shelf the book sits on. Some of the DNA is the floor and the walls for organizational purposes. So the three tasks of DNA are organization, regulation, as well as production of the proteins. And a lot of what is present are called pseudogenes. They look like genes, that's why they're called pseudogenes, but they don't produce protein, but their job is regulation. They produce RNA that does regulation in the production of proteins. So it's far more complex than anyone imagined. And then the next issue is that not only did the Human Genome Project successfully sequence the genome that we have, but the follow-up project, the ENCODE project, ENCODE, Encyclopedia of DNA Elements, took on the task of figuring out what the DNA actually does. And so it's now been determined for at least 80% of the DNA what the functions are. Now, this is so different than the evolutionary assumption made a few decades ago that the DNA that did not code for proteins was leftover junk from evolution. They called it junk DNA. Well, that has been totally wiped out. There is not junk DNA. It's a matter of, do we understand what is actually happening? And so that shows that initially it was a combination of ignorance and arrogance that led to the assumption of junk DNA. And that set medicine back by about 25 years in order to be able to progress and work with curing diseases. And it's a rerun of this business of vestigial organs. So, 100 years ago, we were told that, I'll just round it off, that there were 100 structures or organs in the human body that were left over from evolution that were useless and no good anymore. And yet, as we have learned more, that list has been wiped out because we now know what all of these things do in the body. They have a purpose. So it was ignorance and arrogance on the part of evolutionists, assuming leftover organs, of which the appendix is the number one example. And now that same argument had been used and is still being used in DNA, but again, as we learn more and find out more and more what the DNA does, that percentage of what is not identified keeps shrinking. Because God did not create junk.
Amen. And 2 books I recommend: Jonathan Wells' The Myth of Junk DNA, and also Jonathan Wells' Icons of Evolution, Science or Myth. He gets into some of that, and I think it's excellent work. So yeah, Brady does have a sentence relating to some of what you're just saying there. By now, many people in the Western world have heard the striking statistic that human beings and chimpanzees share about 98% of the same genomic sequencing. But what does that mean? Well, consider that any 2 human beings, person A and person B, differ from one another genetically by only about 0.1%, which means the remaining 99.9% of DNA data that we share explains why we are all so alike. Yet, incredibly, there is much biological information stored in that 0.1% that it can account for you being person A and me being person B. Can this same molecular math explain why humans and chimpanzees are much less similar to one another, and yet the 2 species still possess similar anatomy and various other traits? Now, I want to stop there. He doesn't go deep into it, but their similar anatomy, he gets into homology, or at least alludes to what do they call it, homology, right? Where it's like, well, look at the bat wing. It's kind of like our forearm and stuff like that. Can you briefly speak upon that? Because that's just a casual sentence. But let's talk about this similar anatomy evidence for common descent argument that you see, and we see the brief allusion to it here.
Well, the arm in the human, a forearm in a cat or a dog, the wing of a bat, the flipper in a whale, they all have the same bones given the same names in the same place, but they have extremely different functions. But it's not a matter of common descent. It's a matter of a common designer using efficiency in design and then changing the design as needed for the different function intended for that animal.
Exactly. The genetic differences in distance between man and the great apes is far from remarkable. The chimpanzee's genomic sequence is around 1.2 to 2% different from ours, depending upon what information we are talking about. Gene substitutions versus entire genome, not including deleted genes. Even though 1.2% might not sound like a lot of genetic information, it is far greater than the 0.1% separating person A and person B, and it is apparently enough to make all the difference in the world between 2 species. To be fair, that number can grow to about 4 or 5% if deleted or duplicated genes are included in the count. But even the deleted and partial genes in a species genome can tell a convincing and compelling story about how one is related to another. Observe the following. And I do want to real quick give a shout out to Nate 2D2, the best moderator in the business. There you go. For finding these programs that we have done. A lot of people don't know I have done other programs on this topic. Here is Are Humans 98% Chimp? And that's with, I believe, the late Dr. Jeffrey Tompkins. And I encourage people to check that out, as well as the whole playlist that Nate just dropped. Appreciate that, brother.
Dr. Tompkins is a great resource.
Yes, indeed. And so, we're looking at this, and, this is supposed to be convincing proof for evolution, all this stuff put together. But it seems like, you have a lot of issues never dealt with here, and even some out-and-out mistakes, and just really a lot of mistaken assumptions when you read through this. I mean, when you first read this, what was your general impression of this book, of this chapter, Many Convincing Proofs by Brady Goodwin Jr. here in Chapter 5? What was your kind of first impression? Maybe I should have started with that, but what was your first thought there, Dr. Kezele?
He let himself be led astray by false assumptions and then interpreting things, unfortunately, due to circular reasoning with those false assumptions. Yeah.
Yes. And real quick, Nate, you may be right. I mean, Dinu may be the best mom in the business, but I'm just saying it because you're here, and if she was here, I'd say it to her instead. Just teasing. You guys, it's hard. It's like, you know what it is with you and Dinu, Nate? It's much like baseball this year. You've got Aaron Judge, who hit 62 home runs, breaking Roger Maris's 1961 record for the New York Yankees, and of course he plays for New York too. Broke the record and sets the American League record for most home runs in a year. Quite fascinating, pretty amazing, right? But then you've got this guy Ohtani, who's just having a great pitching season and also an amazing offensive season. He's a pitcher and a batter in a modern era where people don't do that anymore since the days of Babe Ruth. So who do you give the MVP to? It's really difficult to tell. So anyways, between you and Dinu, Nate, I have that same struggle every day. One of you is Aaron Judge and one of you is Ohtani. I'm not sure who's who. But that's what we got going on here. I got, these awesome moderators helping out. Great. And again, though, tell people about AZUSA on social media. For those who are still joining us, Dr. Joseph Kezele is a retired doctor, full-time now in creation ministry. Does a lot here locally, all throughout the state of Arizona, and you can find their material online. Share that again one more time, brother.
Right. If you go to azusa.org, you'll find that we currently have meetings scheduled in 9 of the different counties in Arizona. We're looking to expand into a 10th, hopefully in the next few months. And so we bring in speakers from out of state, also local speakers who are very well versed in various areas of science. We even have our own resident geologist. And so this information is available. We also offer resources in terms of DVDs and books at the meetings as well.
And they're excellent meetings. You actually are going to be speaking at the Reborn Church as part of our Apologetics rotation here, November. What is it? November 11th or November 12th?
The 11th.
Thank you. Appreciate that. It's a Friday night, and you're going to be speaking on Does God Exist? Very excited about that presentation. Does God Exist? We've been promoting it. Let's promote it some more. It's already up on your guys' website, and I look forward to it. In about a month from now, you'll be speaking there, so we appreciate that.
Yes.
Okay, so we're looking, and there's a lot more on the genetics here. He gets into some Francis Collins stuff and the human. Can we briefly say something about Collins? And I don't know if you want to talk about the biologos people in general, but some brief things, because we only have a little amount of time, but let's at least address Collins. And, of course, he has his book, The Language of God, and all of that. But talk about that, because he relies on Collins a lot here.
He's a brilliant man, Collins is, and he's tremendously accomplished, fantastically so, involved in the Human Genome Project and being the director of National Institutes of Health. Tremendous accomplishments. But he assumes the evolutionary time frame and then, unfortunately, interprets things in that light, in that evidence. Some few years ago, after his book, The Language of God, came out, I wrote a review of that book, and that review is available on the Answers in Genesis website.
Yes, so if you guys search Kezele, Dr. Joseph Kezele, you will find that review of that book on the AIG website. Okay, let's end with this. There's a little bit more in here, but I wanted to get a few questions from the audience. Okay, here's what you do. You put a capital Q, a colon, and a question mark at the end of the sentence, and we'll put your question on the screen. Jay Fry says, coming in late, but I assume we've discussed evolution is satanic, yes? Comes in guns blazing there. What do you want to say about that, Dr. Kezele?
Well, anything that leads people away from the God of the Bible is anti-God. So,
All right.
Yeah.
Nice, sweet, short, simple. Eddie Sally, do identical twins have the same DNA?
They do, but they don't necessarily have the same medical histories because of this business of epigenetics, that there can be alteration in the things that happen to the DNA, like I said, methylation or phosphorylation, those kinds of things. So, in fact, I have first cousins who are beautiful twin ladies who I can distinguish one from the other, and they do have some differences, but their DNA, the actual sequence, is the same.
Excellent. Okay. Yeah, we even in our live chat in our Street Apologist family, we know some folks who have twins. Shout out to them and their twin. Mr. Green says my oldest boy loves AIG. Want to go ahead?
Yeah, let me get back to twins. Actually, we're assuming that there are twins that came from the same egg that split, as opposed to two different eggs, two different sperm.
Right. Yeah, different types of twins. Answers in Genesis. Let me comment on that. Mr. Green, before this program last night and some things like that, I did some reading, but I also said, let me sit down and watch Answers.tv. So I subscribe to their streaming service. It's the only streaming service that I haven't canceled, and because I've canceled everything else, I don't have anything like that unless someone shares an account. But I have not canceled Answers.tv because it is so amazing, the content they have on their streaming service. You download the app. I forget what it is. It's very affordable. And the content is amazing. Yes, they have lectures, but they have individual shows they produce for people of all ages. And some of my favorite stuff is produced by, I forgot his last name right now, but a man with the first name of, I believe, Calvin. And he leads Answers in Genesis Canada and does these really cool little shorter, well-produced clips that are so good. And so I just encourage everyone to check out the Answers.tv streaming service. I don't know if you've been able to see that, but it's amazing.
No, I haven't, but changing the subject, if I may.
Yeah.
I'd like to get back to when I spoke extensively on continuous environmental tracking. I would like to acknowledge Dr. Randy Galuza, who's the one who has really heavily promoted that and brought that to the forefront, and he is currently the president of the Institute for Creation Research. He's also another remarkable fellow in that he started out in undergraduate school as engineer training, and then the Lord told him to go get biblical training, so then he went to Chicago, got his theological degree. Then the Lord told him to go back and finish his engineering degree, which he did. Then the Lord told him to go to medical school, which he did. And then on the side, he got a master's of public health. And then he served in the Air Force for 20 years as a flight surgeon. And so with his tremendous wide range of training as an engineer and in medicine, he clearly sees how all these engineering principles take place in the cell and in the body in general.
Fascinating. Yeah, shout out to ICR as well. Right. Mike B, can DNA be sequenced?
Can DNA be sequenced? It has been sequenced.
Can you speak on that a little bit more? Because, we kind of just talked about that. But, right. People come in at different times and hear different things, so it's all good.
Right. It's been extensively sequenced. As a matter of fact, the original cost was in the millions of dollars, but now a person's DNA can be sequenced in the range of $1,000. The technology has been so advanced and improved, so now it can be sequenced in very short periods of time and much less expensively.
Excellent. What does, Mr. Green wants to know, the Cambrian explosion say about the flood story?
Well, that's a great question. It shows that there's this sudden appearance that can't be explained through evolution, but through the flood laying down the layers of organisms in these order of these ecological zones, poof, you get that. And by the way, just to explain what they mean by Cambrian explosion, the explosion part refers to the sudden appearance in the fossil record of these marine invertebrates with nothing underneath them to explain how they got there. And the word Cambrian comes from the Latin term for the area of Great Britain that's known as Wales today. The Latin name was Cambria, and that's where those were first found.
Yeah, and there's some good DVDs on this put out by Myers organization that I like, the Discovery Institute, where you may not agree with the time scale, but they show all these creatures and these body plans and body types and say, you know, underneath all this, folks, is genetic information. You know, what's going on here? Jay Fry wants to know, did Darwin confess on his deathbed evolution is a lie?
Okay, my understanding is that is not true, that was promulgated by a lady in English society, but that is not true. But I don't know for a fact. Only God knows.
Yeah, I've heard that's sort of an urban legend as well. You know, that's something that did not happen. That's what I understand to be the case as well. Okay, shout out to everyone in the live chat, and I want to see if anybody else has any other questions as we wind up here. Mr. Green noted that that story of that fraud that originated out of China, was it the feathered dinosaur or whatever, actually was published in National Geographic.
That's right. Got tremendous publicity in the magazine, on, you know, TV specials, all sorts of stuff. And then about 6 months later, other evolutionary paleontologists said, can we take a look at this? And they said, you know what, you better do a CT scan, and that's how the fraud was discovered.
Excellent. Well, we do appreciate that there was some corrections made in that. C. Road Warrior says, thanks for doing this vocab. It's very helpful and important. Hopefully Brady will make his way to answer for his claims in his book. Jay Fry says, prayers for Phanatik to come back to the light in Jesus' mighty name. And LJ says, thank you for going over this information. I pray Phanatik can hear this and think over the information. I agree with that, and I appreciate those very much. Only a few more questions, and then we're going to get out of here, ladies and gentlemen. Eddie Sally says, Vocabulary, please type out his book, please. It's Let There Be Gaslight. Brady Goodwin Jr. This is the book we are reviewing, and to be frank with you today, correcting. Let There Be Gaslight. It just dropped recently, and we want to answer the claims that Brady makes in the book, hopefully with respect and gentleness and fairness, but also firmness. Jay Fry, Dr. Kezele, how old is the Earth?
Well, we use the chronogenealogies in Scripture given us in chapters 5, 10, and 11. And so we can say that the time from creation to Christ is 4,004 years, and then the 2,022 years since then. So that would give us, what, 6,026 years?
All right. And we definitely understand, that puts us in the minority, not just amongst what they call mainstream science, but obviously even amongst a lot of Christians. But I encourage people to at least consider the position. Here's a book I'd recommend, Faith, Form, and Time by Dr. Kurt Wise. Faith, Form, and Time, Dr. Kurt Wise. What the Bible teaches and science confirms about creation and the age of the universe. There's a number of other books, but that's one I'll give a shout out to off the top. Okay, we are about to end and wind down. One last time, we got to make sure you tell people about things that are coming up here with AZOSA, your organization, and shout out to everyone in AZOSA. If you're in Arizona, become a member, attend a meeting. Tell us about maybe even what's on the horizon, the future for you, what the Lord has you doing, my friend.
Well, for the foreseeable future, I hope to continue to be a full-time professor at Arizona Christian University and to continue to work with AZOSA until either the Lord returns or he takes me, one or the other.
All right. Well, that sounds good to me. And you have some things you've written online. Are those scattered at different places, or is AIG the best place to search for things you've written?
Well, I haven't written so much. I've written a few things, but there are a fair number of recordings of presentations I've made, and a fair number of those are available on the AZOSA website.
Okay.
And then a couple of them are actually been produced. One of them is called Made in His Image that ICR produced, and it's a 4-DVD set, and I'm one of those 4 DVDs.
And that is something that you guys really promoted heavily in Russia and Croatia and Armenia, I believe.
Yeah, we teach all this stuff over there as well. Yeah,
Excellent.
And then AZOSA itself, we have produced 6 DVDs, which we offer for sale either on the web or at our meetings as well.
Excellent. Shout out to Mr. Green. Shout out to Nate. Shout out to Jay Fry. Father, continue to pour your spirit upon the good doctor to spread your truth in Jesus' name. Couldn't say I disagree with that. All right, I think we've about covered it. Again, I appreciate your time and expertise in this area. There's only a few more chapters, ladies and gentlemen, for us to cover in the Let There Be Gaslight book. We have covered Crisis of Faith, Chapter 1, with Tonic and Earthquake. Chapter 2, Has God Said? Alex did that. Like Literally, with Dr. Michael Brown. Chapter 4, Just a Theory, with James Umber and Marty Clapp. Many Convincing Proofs, that's here today. Chapter 5, Evolving on Genesis, with Eric Hovind. We did that. Origin Stories and Revisionist History, Part 1 and 2. BK did that with some other gentlemen on his channel. The Fall Far from the Tree, Chapter 9, and Chapter 10 and Chapter 11, those are still coming out. So we have not done 9, 10, and 11. Chapter 12 was with Eli, Truth versus Trust, Revealed Apologetics. Chapter 13, Adam Coleman, What of God? I believe he still got to... Oh, I'm sorry, they did that recently about arguments for God's existence. They did that recently. That was one of the most current ones. What of Morality and What of Sin? I believe those Adam is still working on as well. And then we even did a general overview of the Table of Contents with William Mendoza. And the title itself, BK Apologist, covered. So we've only got a few left, and the playlist is pretty awesome. And I'm very excited about what has come out and what will still come out. So that's it. Let's end this show. And again, thank you very much, brother. I hope you have a blessed day and a blessed weekend.
Thank you for having me. I very much appreciate being here. Yes. And for what you do.
Yes, sir. I appreciate that. All right, y'all. God bless. Peace out. Shalom.